Hi, I'm Dana Anderson, and welcome to Growing Bright Futures. Today's show is brought to you by Building Bright Futures, which is a statewide nonprofit organization which is put in place to support the state systems which focus on early childhood throughout the state of Vermont. And here in Addison County, we are focused on early childhood cross-sector, and we are really looking at how families deal with different types of transitions. And today we're going to talk with Professor Lawrence Shelton from UVM to talk to us a little bit about how separation and divorce might affect the family and how we can best support kids that are going through this transition. So welcome, Larry. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great. Thank you, Dana.
Great. So could you tell us a little bit about yourself and where you're coming from?
Sure. I'm a child psychologist by training and have been in the state for 45 years. And as a child psychologist, I've been interested in children and families, and divorce is a part of that experience. So I've been teaching human development and family studies at UVM for those 45 years, and I've expanded my interests and my expertise, I hope, from children and adolescents to family systems and lifespan development. And over the last 10 or 15 years, looking more at the community and the ecosystem that supports or doesn't support children and families. But I've been involved in a number of different programs for children and for adolescents in my time professionally. I got interested in divorce when I was first a graduate student working with families who were divorcing. And over the years, I continued that interest, and it really intensified after I came to Vermont and was dealing with some child abuse issues, testifying in court as an expert witness, and then testifying on behalf of children in, it wasn't family court at that time, it was before family court, but when families were disputing what they were going to do with their children and couldn't agree, then I would get called in as an expert. So I spent a number of years part-time doing family evaluations and looking at how parents were treating their children and learning more and more about the impact of separation and divorce on kids. And in that process of working with the courts, I saw some of the very worst situations that kids could be in, where they weren't being abused, but sometimes I wanted to say, why don't you give your children up to be adopted by somebody who actually cared about them and could focus on them. I got deeply into divorce and families as a result of that work. I did what a professor usually does, which is try to teach a course so the students can catch me up on the research. And that course I think I first did that in 1990 or 91. It was a group of graduate students who were interested in parenting through separation and divorce. And they, about half of them were divorced or divorcing. One of them separated during the course. They got interested in what they were learning about families and children, and they kept coming across research and saying, why doesn't everybody know about this? Because they were seeing people behave badly and hurting their children as they went through divorce. So a group of them decided to start a resource center in the Northeast Kingdom in St. Johnsbury, and they did that, and that ran for 3 or 4 years. Another student found a program for divorcing parents that was being taught in family court in Georgia. She wanted a master's thesis. She wondered if she could try to start the program. And a little bit stepping back from that, she and I had been involved at the very beginning of family court to advise the family court judges on how they dealt with divorce and provide training for attorneys. So they would stop, we hoped, dividing the children along with the property and the debts and treat the family as a whole that needed to support children. So we had a connection to Judge Fisher at the time and approached her about offering this 4-hour workshop in family court, which we piloted in 1992. It's still going on. It's been 24 years now. It's required by the judges in every county in Vermont, and we've been through 2 or 3 curricula. The most recent one I still have a hand in editing a bit. I no longer teach the course or direct it, but I provide a little bit of moral support. And in that process, I got involved very deeply in how divorces are handled in court. I ended up helping to start a group nationally of people who do divorce education. We meet every year, 3 weeks from tomorrow, I think, in Minneapolis. And I've continued to teach the course occasionally and continued to consult with families. Most importantly, and connected to the workshop that I'll be doing here next week, I've done many, many workshops for child care providers and teachers and parents about how to support the children while they're going through the separation and divorce. So that's where I am. And it's been a very interesting learning experience all the way through.
Great. So you are coming next Monday, October 17th, and you'll be doing a workshop here in Addison County at Ilsley Library for both parents and also for caregivers.
Right.
To help come together to really support kids going through this transition. And I believe the same night there will be childcare and dinner also provided to families.
At the Mary Johnson Child Care Center.
Okay, sure. At Mary Johnson.
Right.
Okay, well, we'll have that information up at the end of the show.
Good.
So let me ask you a little bit about how you began to develop this curriculum. So when you started developing this curriculum that was used in the courts, what were some of the goals, what were the main goals that you were looking to achieve for families?
The main goal is to help them do a better job of parenting while they're going through separation and divorce. What children need most as that's happening is parents who are still involved and not fighting with each other. And parents are the ones who are going to be affecting their children as they go through any family transition. And it's a really bad time for families. Parents are distracted, they're angry at each other, it's very difficult for them to keep their focus on the children. So we set up the 4-hour workshop in family court so that it would focus on what kids are experiencing and what they need and how parents can support them as they go through it. It's evolved a bit over the years. We spend less time on issues like grief and dealing with the sadness that the family has changed, more time on how to have a healthy relationship with somebody that you're not very happy about at the moment, and a lot about emotional support for children. So it's evolved as we've understood things better. We also don't talk about it as being divorce as much because we realize that about 1/3 of the parents who come through are actually not married. With the decline in the marriage rates, we have many, many parents who are cohabiting, sometimes for years and years with children, but when they separate in Vermont, if they're going to establish a parenting agreement and child support, they have to go through the course. So it's changed a bit, but overall the goals are to help people still figure out how to be competent parents while they're going through a time that's really tough for parents as well as for kids. And one of the things that is a problem for parents is seeing the kids suffering. So they want to do something, and the course is really helpful. A couple of things we've learned over the years, and I'm starting to write about this. I'll be doing a presentation at the meeting in Minneapolis on this. We all know that the 4-hour workshop is just sort of sensitizing parents to the possibilities of doing a better job and some of the brief skills about how to do that. But from the very beginning, we've we've had the experience, everybody who teaches it, we have a wonderful group of long-term instructors who love doing the course. And we've all had the experience of having parents come up during a break or after the course and say, why wasn't I taught this before I had children? Or why don't we have to learn this before we get married? And I don't have answers for that. I think they're perfectly valid questions, but we're always struck by the fact that so many of the people going through the workshop have not had any training in being parents. They've not had any education in how to have a good relationship. One of one of the striking experiences I had was we had talked a little bit about relationship skills, and which is a small part of the course. And a gentleman came up during the break and said, that was really interesting, what you were saying about relationship skills. Where can I find out about those? And all of us who teach the course wish that we could do maybe a year-long course on all of the topics that people need, and maybe do it before they get married. But very few states provide that, and a lot of us just don't have what we need in the way of background. We learn it as we go along.
Mm-hmm. I think that would be a pretty common reaction from any parent, that we didn't go to college to learn how to be parents,
right,
specifically.
Yeah. And I'm aware that way back in the good old days, in the 50s and 60s and even to the 70s, a lot of students took a family relations course in their home economics departments in high school. Mm-hmm. They took parenting and they took child care courses, and over the last 20 years those courses have become fewer and fewer, particularly in New England. They still exist in the Midwest in many school districts. Vermont actually has a law on the books. I think it's still in force. It was I've forgotten the name, the number, but it created a comprehensive health education program in every school. It's the only time the legislature has gone directly into curriculum and said you must teach these things. And it was comprehensive health education, and it had to include parenting, child development, marriage, and in addition to public health and other things of that sort. And I served on the Comprehensive Health Education Advisory Committee for the State Department of Education, now the Agency of Education, for several years. And we tried very hard to get schools to teach those courses again, so people would be better prepared to have children and to be married. And what we've seen in Vermont particularly is that those courses are fewer and fewer. So we're turning out 18-year-olds, calling them adults, and not teaching them much of what they need to know to be adults, and particularly to have children. So we end up with a lot of divorces.
Mm, we do. Do you know what the statewide rate of divorce is?
I don't. Nationally, it's for first-time marriages, it's a little under 50%. It's been declining a bit. I think the last figure I saw nationally was 47. I haven't looked at the Vermont figures. I have no reason to think we're any worse or any better than other states.
Sure. So what might be a consequence of divorce on a child? Mm-hmm. What might that look like?
Well, it's a very complex picture, but essentially what we're doing is taking away the things that kids most need to develop well, particularly young children. Kids need to have stable relationships. They need to have parents who are engaged with them. They need to have a safe environment where they're not anxious or afraid. They need to have a predictable schedule. No, reasonably predictable. I don't mean clockwork, but the sort of thing that lets you know what's about to happen. And what happens when people begin the divorce process, which is often long before they divorce, is that safe environment of home becomes filled with conflict. And we know that even very, very small infants respond to angry voices. They respond to the physical characteristics of a parent who's trying to hold them while they're angry. Parents are not relaxed, and kids, as one of my favorite theorists used to say, emotions are contagious. And if parents are angry and anxious or afraid, their children are going to be anxious and afraid as well. And that keeps kids from learning and being comfortable in their environment. So the first thing that happens in a divorce situation is that kids start becoming afraid and anxious, worried about, if they're older, they worry about what's going to happen to them. If they're very young, they don't know what's happening, so they're afraid of it. And then as the separation happens, that home space gets changed, and sometimes kids are bounced around between parents, and often one or both of the parents don't have a solid home. They don't know where they're going to be, so they may be couch surfing, they may be moving in with parents temporarily, or siblings, or somebody else in the family. And all of those changes make young children anxious because they're going into something that they don't understand. So that's the biggest thing that's happening. And anxiety and fear keep kids from learning. So what we need to do is to make sure that we're supporting kids to be in one or two situations, such as childcare or preschool, that's predictable, that's not being disturbed by the separation and divorce. So they have one place to go at least. It could be a grandparent's home, it could be any place where people are going to focus on the child, and the child's going to feel comfortable and be able to explore the world and learn, because that's what keeps their developing rolling along. I've come recently to say that from my ecological perspective, that the primary responsibility of parents is to manage the ecosystem that the child is in and manage the child's participation in it. That's kind of big theoretical stuff, but it's helped me to think about what it is I'm trying to tell parents, that they need to provide that stability as much as they can, and they need to be helping the child understand and adapt to what's going on. So the child is in a situation that's rapidly changing. The faster the changes come and the more there are, the more overloaded the kid's ability is going to be. And kids get to the point where they can't adapt. They just can't cope with what's going on. We call it emotional overload. Either shuts them down, so they just withdraw, and you see a lot of regression for kids. Kids that were toilet trained start wetting the bed. Kids who were fairly secure start sucking their thumbs and whimpering and crying and whining. And other kids start acting out. They say, okay, the best way for me to deal with anxiety and fear is to get aggressive. So they'll come into childcare and walk in and whap another kid and shove them over or hit them, and they don't know why they're doing it. But what happens then, and I've seen this several times, is that they get in trouble in school, in their childcare setting, because they're taking out their fear on other kids, and then they get into a situation where their teacher or their childcare provider starts restricting them, and now the situation that they were in that was safe and should be safe is becoming just another one where they're not safe and don't feel comfortable. So what teachers can do, what childcare providers could do, is recognize what the child is likely to be going through and make sure they get more support for the child. Cut them a little slack so that they're not focusing on the bad behavior, but focusing on the situation the kid is trying to maintain control in, and help them do that. And that might mean telling stories about kids whose parents fight. There are a number of children's books that preschool teachers use. So knowing that that's happening in your classroom or in your childcare center means having access to the materials that might help the kids sort through and talk about what he or she is experiencing. Give them a chance to get their feelings validated, and a teacher to say, that's really tough, yeah, and you're safe here, and an extra hug, and we understand it's difficult. And then what childcare providers can do, and teachers, is to help set clear expectations for parents, because parents don't know what the rules are. And some of them are still operating on the, I'm betrayed, I'm hurt, so I'm going to hurt the other person back. They retaliate. And that never helps. And the kids aren't helped by it. So what we advise the people who are working with the parents is to say, here's how you feel, and we understand that, but here's what your kid needs. Your first responsibility is to parent. It's not retaliation. It's to make sure your child is getting what your child needs. And as you do that, one of the things you need to do is keep the conflict away from the child. And think about the fact that you're going to be parenting with this other person for the rest of your lives, grandparenting with them. And you need to figure out when the child is 3 or 4 that that's what you're going to do. And you're going to do it without embarrassing the child, making the child uncomfortable, throwing glasses and bottles and bouquets at the kid's wedding, all of those things that parents actually do that aren't helpful for the child. So parents and teachers and professionals can all have the conversation about what do we need long term and how are you going to get there. There's lots of other stuff going on for the parents. One of the messages in the workshop for both parents and for providers and teachers, for the professionals, is that parents often invite professionals, teachers, to get involved in the family and in the divorce in a way that isn't healthy for anybody. So I've had many situations described to me where the parents want to talk to the child care provider and the teacher, and they do that, but the professional gets sucked into taking sides. And that's not healthy for the parents, and it eventually interferes with the professional's role in supporting the child. So one of the important messages is that professionals are on the child's side, and they don't take sides with the parents, either one, and instead help the parents figure out what their behavior is doing to the child and how they can behave appropriately. So we push getting along as best you can and keeping the conflict to a minimum. One of the things I learned very early on, and it's still true from the research, is that children are responding, the most important thing they respond to is parental conflict. So when parents are arguing, screaming, yelling, all of those things, not cooperating, bad-mouthing each other to the child, that's the worst thing that kids have to deal with, and they shouldn't have to deal with it. And as they're dealing with it, parents often ask, when will my kids start behaving normally again? And the answer to that is when the conflict stops. So as long as the conflict stops, the child's development is going to be disrupted. And at the point where that conflict is reduced, the kid will start developing. So parents who remain fiery enemies for years have kids who come to college whose development has been stunted. And I deal with those as a professor regularly, so especially because I teach family relations. Students always want to know, what went wrong in my family? So we work through that. We talk about the fact that their parents are still fighting about paying tuition, or they're still fighting about who's going to come to graduation. And I have students whose parents have been divorced since they were small, who've never gotten along and haven't tried. And the student says to me, I'm not going to graduation because I don't want to expose myself, or ask just one parent and not the other. And I explain to them, I think one of the best things I do is explain to children and to my students that they have rights as children. And they have the right for their parents to behave civilly. And they should invite everybody to graduation and tell them what they expect them to do, which is you're going to come, you're going to sit together, you can bring your new partners if you want, but you're going to be civil, and I'm going to have dinner with both of you and anybody else you want to invite, and you're going to be nice. And students say, I can't say that to my parents. And I said, try it. And when they try it, the parents show up and they do what they're supposed to do. Mm-hmm. So I think the lesson for me broadly is that we as a society need to be telling parents how to behave mm-hmm. at a time when they really need to know and often don't know. Mm-hmm. So
it's really fascinating work.
It is.
Yes, and it sounds like really empowering that the child knows what's best, and parents need to focus on the children's needs.
Right. And also be aware that what the child really wants, which is to have the two parents back together lovingly, mm-hmm. isn't going to happen. So the lesson for kids is you can't always have what you really want. So let's make the next best thing, mm-hmm. which is let's make a family that is divorced but works well. And you do have the right to that. Absolutely. And resilient families, I think that's a lesson for all of us. Right. Great. Yeah. Anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up today? I hope to see lots of people at the workshop on Monday. Wonderful. And we will make sure that information is shown up at the end of the show. Okay. And we look forward to hopefully chatting with you again in the future, and appreciate your work and your research, and continue spreading the word nationwide about how important this work is. Thank you, Dana. Thank you so much. I've enjoyed it. And thank you for watching today. Again, this is Growing Bright Futures. Our regular host, Cheryl Mitchell, will be back next month. And we want to give a special thanks to Trelevin, Let's Grow Kids, and Middlebury Community Television for being in partnership to promote this show. And thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you next time.